There is a photograph taken in Milan in the summer of 1997, just weeks before everything ended, showing three figures standing before the gilded doors of Via Gesù 12, Gianni Versace at the center, his sister Donatella to his right, her platinum hair catching the afternoon light like spun metal, and their older brother Santo positioned slightly behind them both, his hand resting protectively on Gianni's shoulder. The palazzo behind them gleams with the kind of wealth that seems permanent, architectural, immune to the chaos of ordinary lives. The marble is white, the iron gates are black, the flowers in the window boxes are perfectly arranged. In the photograph, Donatella is smiling, her face radiant with the particular confidence that comes from being loved by a genius and living at the apex of global fashion. Her dress is vintage Versace, naturally, cut low and embroidered with gold thread. She wears sunglasses even though the sun is setting. But within 72 hours of this image being captured, Gianni would be dead on the steps of his Miami mansion, shot twice in the head by a stranger, and Donatella would inherit not just an empire but a weight so crushing it would nearly destroy her entirely. What happened to the Versace sisters after that gunshot is a story of isolation, addiction, and the unbearable cost of carrying a name that the whole world recognizes but almost no one truly understands. A dynasty built on silk. Welcome to Velvet Tragedies, where inherited wealth meets hidden history. This is the story of Donatella and Francesca Versace, two women born into the same family but separated by vastly different inheritances of tragedy, and how the death of their brother Gianni fractured their lives in ways that no amount of money or power could ever repair. You will see how a fashion empire worth nearly $1 billion became a gilded cage, how fame turned into isolation, and how the women who stood beside one of the greatest designers of the 20th century were left to carry his ghost long after the cameras stopped flashing. What you are about to understand is that behind the runway shows and the celebrity friendships and the billion-dollar valuations, there existed a profound and relentless loneliness that wealth did not cushion, it magnified. Donatella Francesca Versace was born on May 2, 1955 in Reggio Calabria, a coastal city in southern Italy, where the mountains meet the sea and the air smells of citrus and salt, and the faint bitterness of bergamot. She was the youngest of 4 children born to Antonio Versace, a salesman who sold appliances door to door, and often came home exhausted and covered in dust, and Francesca Versace, a dressmaker who ran a small atelier from the ground floor of their modest home on Via Medici. The family's wealth did not come from inheritance or aristocratic lineage. It came from fabric, from thread, from Gianni's singular vision and his ability to transform Italian tailoring into global spectacle. Donatella's childhood was not one of palazzos or servants. It was one of crowded rooms and the sound of sewing machines running late into the night, the hiss of steam irons, the rustle of tissue-thin patterns being pinned to silk. Her mother worked with her hands, stitching evening gowns for the wives of local merchants and civil servants, and Donatella learned early that beauty was something you constructed, not something you were born into. The eldest child was Santo, born in 1944, serious and business-minded even as a boy. Then came Tina, who died of tetanus at the age of 12 in 1962, a loss that left the family shattered and silent for years. Then Gianni, born in 1946, who spent his childhood sketching dresses in the margins of his school books and draping fabric over his mother's dress forms. And finally, Donatella, the baby, the one Gianni adored from the moment she was born. Gianni, 11 years her senior, left Calabria for Milan in 1972, and within a decade he had built Versace into one of the most recognizable names in fashion, dressing royalty, rock stars, and supermodels in garments that were unapologetically bold, sexual, and baroque. Donatella followed him north in the late 1970s, not as an employee but as a muse, a confidante, a shadow who understood his vision better than anyone else alive. She became his closest advisor, the only person whose opinion he trusted without question. She lived in his apartments, traveled with him to Paris and New York, attended fittings and photo shoots and late-night dinners where the most famous people in the world competed for Gianni's attention. But the foundation was not as stable as the marble might suggest. By the early 1980s, Donatella had become a fixture in Gianni's world, not merely his sister, but his creative partner, his protector, and the gatekeeper to his increasingly exclusive universe. She married Paul Beck, an American model turned fashion photographer, in 1983, and they had two children, Allegra, born on June 30th, 1986 in Milan, and Daniel, born in 1989. But her marriage was secondary to her true devotion, which was always to Gianni and to the house he had built. Donatella's public image became inseparable from the Versace brand itself. Platinum blonde hair achieved through hours of chemical processing, deep tan maintained year-round, bold makeup applied with precision, a look so distinctive that it became a kind of armor. She attended every show, every opening, every party. She stood beside Gianni at the Met Gala, at Fashion Week in Paris and Milan and New York, at private dinners with Elton John and Princess Diana and Madonna and Sting. The press called her Gianni's muse, his right hand, his mirror. Tabloids nicknamed her the Blonde Ambition and Donatella the Diva, but those who knew them understood that she was more than that. She was his anchor, the person who kept him tethered to the world when his vision threatened to spiral into excess. Donatella lived in Gianni's shadow by choice, not by force, and she seemed for many years entirely content there. Her role was clearly defined. She was the interpreter, the amplifier, the one who took his sketches and turned them into reality on the runway. She oversaw the Versace line, Versace's younger and edgier diffusion brand, and she had final approval on advertising campaigns, which in the 1990s featured photographers like Richard Avedon and models like Naomi Campbell, Lindy Evangelista, and Christy Turlington. In private, she was known for her fierce protectiveness, her willingness to confront anyone who questioned Gianni's genius or threatened his peace. There was a story that circulated among the Versace inner circle about a dinner in 1991 at Harry's Bar in Venice, where a journalist asked Gianni if he feared being overshadowed by newer, younger designers like Tom Ford or Alexander McQueen. Before Gianni could respond, Donatella stood, leaned across the table, and told the journalist to leave. The room fell silent. Gianni only smiled. That was the nature of their bond. Unspoken, absolute, unbreakable. Donatella's power came not from her own name, but from her proximity to his, and for a long time that seemed like enough. The Versace empire grew relentlessly through the 1990s, expanding into fragrances like Blonde and Versace Pour Homme, into home goods, into hotels and luxury resorts. By 1997, the company was valued at approximately $807 million USD, and Gianni was preparing to take it public, a move that would have made the Versace family one of the wealthiest in Italy. Donatella was 42 years old, still beautiful, still devoted, still standing in the wings while Gianni took his bows. She had everything she had ever wanted. She was at the peak of her visible power, her influence, her certainty, and then everything ended. Then the year changed. On the morning of July 15th, 1997, Gianni Versace was shot twice on the front steps of his mansion at 1116 Ocean Drive in Miami Beach by Andrew Cunanan, a spree killer who had murdered 4 other men across the United States in the preceding months. Gianni was 50 years old. He had been returning from his daily walk to a nearby cafe where he purchased Italian newspapers and magazines. He was wearing shorts and a white shirt. He was alone. The gunshots were heard by neighbors, and within minutes the street was filled with police and paramedics and photographers who had been tipped off by police scanners. Gianni's body was covered with a white sheet. The blood pooled on the steps. The news reached Donatella while she was at her home in Milan, and according to those who were with her, she collapsed entirely, her body unable to hold the weight of what she had just been told. She screamed, she vomited, she had to be sedated. She flew to Miami immediately on a private jet, accompanied by Santo and her husband Paul, but by the time she arrived, Gianni's body had already been removed and taken to the Dade County Medical Examiner's office. She stood on the steps where he had died, and someone later recalled that she did not cry. She simply stared at the bloodstains on the white marble and said nothing at all. She touched the step. She knelt down. She placed her hand where his head had been. The funeral was held in Milan on July 22nd, 1997, at the Duomo, and was attended by more than 2,000 people, including Elton John, Sting, and Princess Diana, who would herself be dead within 6 weeks in a car crash in Paris. Donatella walked behind the casket wearing black Versace, black sunglasses, and holding her daughter Allegra's hand. Allegra was 11 years old. She wore black and looked utterly lost. Photographers captured the moment, and the images circulated globally. Donatella's face was blank, her expression unreadable, as though she had shut down completely. What no one understood at the time was that Gianni had left 50% of the Versace company to Allegra, who was 11 years old. Donatella inherited 20%. Santo, the eldest brother, received 30%. But the will did more than divide assets. It placed an unimaginable burden on Donatella's shoulders. Gianni had named her as his creative successor. She was now responsible for continuing his vision, for designing collections that would honor his legacy, for keeping the empire alive. And she had no training, no formal design education, no experience leading the atelier. She had always been the muse. Now she was expected to be the genius. She was expected to fill a void that could never be filled. Donatella's unraveling began quietly, in the months immediately following Gianni's death, and then accelerated with devastating speed. She threw herself into work, designing her first solo collection for spring 1998, which debuted in Milan in October 1997, less than 3 months after Gianni's murder. The collection was called In Memory of Gianni, and it was a tribute to everything he had loved. Gold mesh, safety pins, bold prints, Medusa heads embroidered on leather. The reviews were mixed. Some critics praised her for honoring Gianni's aesthetic. Others said the collection lacked his daring, his precision, his soul. Donatella read every review, absorbed every criticism, and began to believe that she was failing him. She started using cocaine, first occasionally at parties, then daily, then constantly. The drug allowed her to work through the night, to silence the voice in her head that told her she was not enough, that she would never be enough. But how do you grieve the person who defined your entire identity when the world is watching and waiting for you to prove that you deserve to carry his name? The pressure was relentless, and there was no space for weakness, no room for collapse. Donatella's weight dropped to a dangerously low level. Her skin grew gaunt. Her eyes became hollowed. She appeared at fashion shows looking radiant under the lights, her hair perfect, her makeup flawless, but those close to her saw the tremor in her hands, the hollowness in her eyes, the way she would disappear into the bathroom for 10 minutes and return with a different energy entirely. Her marriage to Paul Beck ended in 2000. They divorced quietly, and Paul took the children to the United States for extended periods, trying to shield them from what was happening to their mother. Donatella remained in Milan, alone in the palazzo on Via Gesù, surrounded by Gianni's furniture, his art, his photographs, his absence. She continued to design, continued to appear in public, continued to smile for the cameras, but privately she was disintegrating. By 2004, her cocaine use had become so severe that her family intervened. Santo and her daughter Allegra, now 18 years old and one of the wealthiest teenagers in the world, confronted her in Milan and told her that she needed help. Donatella resisted at first, insisting that she was fine, that she could manage, that the company needed her. But Allegra, who had inherited half of Versace at 11 and had watched her mother collapse under the weight of it, refused to let her continue. She told her mother that she would rather lose the company than lose her. Donatella entered rehab in early 2005, checking into an undisclosed facility in the United States where she remained for several months. When she emerged, she was sober, but she was also profoundly changed, quieter, more fragile, less certain. She returned to Milan and to Versace, but the company was no longer entirely hers. The years that followed were marked by struggle, slow recovery, and the gradual recognition that the Versace empire could not remain a family business forever. Donatella continued to design, and her collections in the late 2000s and 2010s were critically praised, featuring collaborations with artists like Damien Hirst and photographers like Stephen Meisel. She dressed Lady Gaga, Jennifer Lopez, and Blake Lively. She became a celebrity in her own right, referenced in songs and parodied on television. But the financial pressures were mounting. In 2014, the family sold a 20% stake in Versace to Blackstone Group, a private equity firm, for approximately $210 million USD, diluting their control. The sale was described as a strategic move to finance expansion, but it also signaled that the family could no longer sustain the company on their own. In 2018, they sold the entire company to Michael Kors Holdings, later renamed Capri Holdings, for $2.12 billion USD. Donatella remained as creative director, but she no longer owned the name she had spent her entire life defending. She was 63 years old when the sale was finalized, and in interviews afterwards she spoke of relief, of freedom, of finally being able to step out of Gianni's shadow. But there was also something unmistakably sad in her voice, a recognition that the things she had fought so hard to preserve no longer belonged to her. She had survived, but survival had required her to let go. Allegra Versace, who inherited 50% of the company at age 11, became one of the wealthiest young women in Europe, with a net worth estimated at over $800 million USD by the time she turned 18 in 2004. But wealth did not protect her from suffering. She struggled with anorexia nervosa throughout her teenage years, a battle that was documented extensively by the tabloid press, which published photographs of her looking skeletal and frail as she entered and exited universities and cafes in Milan and New York. She was hospitalized multiple times. She largely withdrew from public life, refusing interviews, avoiding fashion shows, and distancing herself from the Versace brand entirely. When the company was sold in 2018, Allegra's share of the sale was estimated at over $800 million USD, but she released no public statement and did not attend the announcement. She lives quietly now, reportedly in New York, and has never given a substantive interview about her uncle, her inheritance, or her mother. She studied French and theatre at Brown University and later at UCLA, but she did not pursue a career in fashion or entertainment. She is, by all accounts, profoundly private, profoundly cautious, and profoundly aware that her wealth is both a gift and a curse. Daniel Versace, Donatella's son, pursued a career in music, performing under the name Dele, and has remained largely out of the public eye. He has given occasional interviews about his music but rarely discusses his family or his childhood. Santo Versace, the eldest sibling, retired from active involvement in the company after the sale and now lives in Milan. He has written books about the fashion industry and occasionally appears at public events, but he is no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of the brand. Francesca Versace, the middle sister who survived childhood and who chose a life far removed from fashion, married young and moved to a small town outside Milan. She has never worked for the company, never attended a fashion show, and has given no interviews. She appears in almost no photographs. She raised her children away from the spotlight, and when Gianni died, she attended the funeral but did not speak publicly. She is the Versace that no one knows, the one who chose obscurity over empire, and in doing so, perhaps, chose sanity. The Versace name remains globally recognized, synonymous with luxury, sex, and Italian glamour, but the family that built it has been scattered, fractured, diminished by loss and the unbearable weight of inheritance. What was lost was not money. There is still an extraordinary amount of money. What was lost was the sense of safety that came from being together, from being needed, from standing beside someone you loved and knowing that you were essential to their vision. This is a story that repeats itself across dynasties, across continents, across generations. The wealth is real. The palazzos are real. The diamonds and the yachts and the front row seats are all real, but so is the isolation, the addiction, the grief that no amount of money can numb. Donatella Versace survived, but survival came at a cost that cannot be easily measured. She lost her brother, her marriage, her company, and very nearly her life. What she gained was sobriety, distance, and a kind of freedom that she never asked for. She is still designing, she is still appearing at events. She is still blonde, still tanned, still wearing Versace. But the woman in the photographs now is not the same woman who stood beside Gianni in 1997. That woman died on the steps in Miami, too. What remains is someone who learned to carry a name that was too heavy, a legacy that was too large, and a grief that was too deep. There is something unbearably poignant about the image of her standing alone in the Versace atelier after the sale, surrounded by sketches and fabric samples and photographs of Gianni, knowing that the thing she spent 2 decades trying to protect is now owned by a corporation in New York, and that the name on the door, her name, her family's name, no longer belongs to them at all. If you're drawn to stories like this, stories of old money, inherited wealth, and the hidden costs of dynastic power, subscribe to Velvet Tragedies. There are more names, more families, more secrets waiting to be told.